You have some thoughts on that, Bobby?
Yeah. I mean, I was marketing recently with folks that I would normally see, you know, if my broader kind of industrial manufacturing background, having meetings with some of the same folks, but, you know, they tend to be buying baskets of stocks. So with the MSOs, for example, the multi-state operators, nobody really knows who's going to win, right? Whose assets are the best. And so they're buying a basket of names. In some cases, they're just playing ETFs as a way to simplify that process. And then, you know, we look at just where the capital is being raised privately right now and the pipeline that's coming, we think, with more of these CSE type listings. You know, last year was about the MSOs, right? It was about how many states you could have in your slide deck, you know, how many cities you were going to be in, how many stores you were going to have by 2020. And all the valuation work was done off of those 2020 numbers. And I think now you're starting to see people looking at different you know, things upstream in the supply chain. So consumer brands, you know, branded products, you know, who has some market share in California. You know, folks with wholesale distribution networks already set up that are now manufacturing for third parties and their own brands. And they're using those distribution networks as a way to get shelf space and guarantee compliant supply. Because that's been an issue, you know, with new regs. A lot of edibles, a lot of other things have failed testing. So, you know, I think that those nuanced business models will come more to, you know, the center stage this year, and people start looking beyond the MSOs to other kind of stuff upstream.
Does anyone make money in this business? I mean, we saw some of the pricing problems that in Roy's deck, and then, you know, I saw Aurora announced results just the other day, and they had some issues in terms of bottom line. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that what you're going to see is that pricing resilience is really going to reside in value add and brand. So I think to Roy's point, and I think we would probably strongly agree on this panel, I mean, it is about having real and effective products, you know, whether those are, you know, CBD or THC. And I think that when people can expand more into novel form factors, you know, when we see those kinds of products, the pricing actually holds up reasonably well. Certainly, we do, you know, expect to see, you know, whole flower continue to you know, be priced like a commodity as it is. So I do think that, you know, success is ultimately going to reside in crossing that chasm out of the sale of, you know, a commoditized product into something that really is a consumer or, you know, medical healthcare, as the case may be, branded product.
I mean,
that's going to be a different picture.
That's really, you know, I mean, I think, Paul, you all were talking about this to one degree or another, which is the opportunity for this one or probably multiple great brands, great national brands to emerge. And it really is just kind of mind-boggling to think that at some point down the road, that will be the case, I guess. I mean, do you guys agree?
I agree. I think it comes down to branding and distribution, much like the alcohol industry in that sense. But we still have a long ways for that to play out. And it's interesting, you know, you walk into a dispensary and they're nice. They're really nice. And I still tell people, go in the dispensary, and there's still that stigma. Oh, I don't want to get my ID. I don't want to go in there, but go check it out. But we're seeing strains, you know, be on the shelf for 6 months, and next 6 months is a different strain or a different brand. So it's moving really quickly, and I think that takes time to play out. You know, in Canada, it's difficult because you're selling to one buyer. And so does that buyer want to buy from 1,000 sources or a few, you know, limited sources that are going to build a brand? It's very difficult because they're labeling and regulations to brand up there. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think this becomes very similar to the alcohol industry with brands and distribution, but that'll play out over time.
And just to give more color on that, I always joke that, you know, the ideal consumer is my wife, the 45-year-old soccer mom who's going to walk into a dispensary the same way she'd walk into Nordstrom's and feel comfortable. Recently, it was in recently I was in Las Vegas, and there's still a number of dispensaries where you walk in and your pulse rate goes up a little bit. You kind of feel like you're doing a drug deal. And when you walk into some that are well done, and it's a very comfortable buying experience. And in terms of context, in terms of alcohol, I think it's very, put it in context, the cannabis business today is a $9 billion market. The U.S. beer market's a $110 billion market. The total alcohol market's a $200 billion market. We think in the cigarette market, it's a $75 billion market. So, we got 10x to go from here. So we're in the top of the first inning. And I think in terms of beer, I think the beer market is very analogous to the cannabis space in terms of there's a lot of local brands that are well known within different regions. And there's a few major brands that made it, right? The Budweisers, the Coors, but there's a lot of regional brands that are very popular in their respective region. So we think that's going to play out the same way in cannabis.
I think the good news is that the consumer has an unmet need, yes, and they're an affluent consumer, as I described earlier. They're willing to pay for it. What their unmet need is largely consistent, predictable experience, as we all like wherever we go. And obviously we find with alcohol, and obviously companies are working very hard on that, and there will be brands that emerge that can command that premium pricing despite decreases in overall pricing. We've seen $19.99 become a very solid price point for edibles, for example. And so as wholesale prices go down, they're making more on those products, and consumers are happy to pay for something that they know will have that consistent experience for them. Bobby, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to Roy's point, I think there is a distinction between alcohol and cannabis in terms of the effects, right? So I think there's probably more opportunity to brand a product by outcome. You can't really brand alcohol by outcome. I guess you could have, very high proof, right? But besides that, and so you're seeing, even in an area that's commoditized like flower, you're seeing successful brands emerge in terms of ignoring the strain name, right, which can get kind of confusing for the average consumer, and focusing on the outcome, sleep, social, calm, creative. And so those companies, by the way, have been able to hold their pricing. Right. So I think that's probably a direction that we'll see things move in terms of moving away from the things like green crack and maybe to specific outcomes.
All right. We are going to have to leave it on that happy note. There's so much more to talk about. I thought this panel was great. We're just scratching the surface, but you got a whole couple days to keep it going. So please join me in thanking Scott Fortune, Bobby Burleson, Paul Penney, Lisa Thomas, and Roy Bingham. Thank you guys so much.
I mean, I think that those effects are fairly subjective, right? And everybody has their own endocannabinoid system that might respond differently to the same formulation. And so I think the main issue right now is that it's a stable formulation. If it's a 4-to-1 CBD to THC vape pen, for example, rather than switching it up and having it be the opposite ratio. And so I think a lot of times consumers at this point in the game just want to be able to show up, either online with the delivery service like in California, or at the dispensary and get the formulation that they know works for them. And so by having, so the FDA, I don't think ever gets involved in whether or not, cannabis flower makes you more creative or more sleepy. Now, if you're talking about specific synthetically created cannabinoid based drugs, which is where I think the actual pharma is going to go, then they'll certainly be involved.
Thanks.
Yeah. Hey, Paul, you mentioned the MSOs. You said something about a quarter of the stores open. What were you referring to there?
Yeah. So
against their license count? Yeah.
In terms of the 5 largest United States MSOs have roughly, let's call it 70 to 80 licenses, and they've only opened 20 to 25. So there's this year is all about opening those stores and executing and opening those stores across the country. So that's what I was referring to.
Yeah. Question. So your discussion has been pretty much about institutional investment and coming into a space that's been probably underground. So how do you plan to take a market that is pretty much very much a, you're estimating $180 billion business? How do you bring the small players up into this institutional investment and make the game and have a game changer? It just seems, the discussion here is about various capital ventures of investing into this industry, but is that talking about a set of folks that have been in this industry for a very long time? And we're talking about creating revenue and jobs. Do they continue to be underground, or do we continue to bring them into the institutional play?
I could just quickly weigh in just on some business models. I mentioned that there are some emerging business models that are a little bit more nuanced than the typical MSOs that we've seen so far. And so one of them is to take license holders that may have gotten that license through some type of state level largesse, right, where there's an underserved community, underrepresented community, and so they're allocating those licenses to those types of potential license holders. And then you have B2B platforms coming in with a turnkey way of getting those license holders up and running. And in some cases, in exchange for that service, rather than a fee, they're requiring 80% of the shelf space with their own products, right? And so that's how they get paid. It's sort of at the back end. And so that's kind of a win-win that we're starting to see emerge in Massachusetts, going forward in some other areas that could help.
But let's face it, in the limited license states, what you're talking about is people who can maneuver millions of dollars in order to get those licenses. Out west, or at least when things got started, if you had a hope and a dream and imagination and hard work, you could get a store up and running, and you could probably get licensed eventually for a few $100. Largely, those days are gone.
Yeah, and there's a lot of private operators that have gotten licenses, but they're now like, oh my God, well now what do I do? And there's a lot of that happening in terms of, they don't really have a plan. They got a license and they got it organically. They got it through reputable ways, but now they need help from a capital standpoint and from a knowledge standpoint. At the end of the day, it comes down to the knowledge base in terms of how to operate a store and having the capital to grow your business.
Hi. So my question is, when you have individuals like myself who have never grown cannabis, but we're coming from it from a scientific process, how do you convince an investor to invest in you? I find that sometimes it's probably easier to get into heaven than to get into this industry. I've been trying to do it for the past 5 years, and we have doctors, we have lawyers, but it's practically impossible when you don't have any type of past performance, having run an operation that's a cannabis base. How do you convince somebody to invest in you?
I haven't figured that out either.
No one knows. This will be the final question.
You've talked about products, you've talked about different companies. How do you think the retail experience is going to evolve with both the options of home delivery and really I'm thinking about discovery, because really cannabis is about discovery for the consumer at this point?
Well, I can just start that. I mean, I think one is I think over time the retail experience is going to, like a traditional retail experience, become increasingly segmented. So there's going to be, the store for me and Paul's wife, and then I think there's going to be some that cater to folks with different interests and sensibilities. I think in this space, traditional bricks and mortar retail is really, really important. And, it's a great boon, I would say, to the retail industry. It's very striking on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan to see all these shuttered, iconic stores, Lord & Taylor. The lights are out, but across the street, there is a gleaming, MedMen dispensary that's been built out. I think that's very, very emblematic. So I do think that you're going to need to be able to have ease of delivery and consumption for committed consumers who know exactly what they want, but we're going to need to have a very, very meaningful retail experience for that kind of, touching and experimentation, because that's so important.
I think real quick, in California, we saw, the passing of legalization, but only 20% of our municipalities or cities have adopted it and have dispensaries. How does the consumer go get legal cannabis? And so now they've passed the legislation now opening up for delivery. So I live in San Diego has 19 dispensaries. They're pretty far for a consumer to drive. But what we're seeing is once they decide on their brand or product or what they like, same with CBD, they'll go online, and now Ease is doing billboards in California. We'll deliver it to you, even though your city is not allowing dispensaries right now. And I think that really helps from a consumer standpoint to receive their, without driving 40 miles or 60 miles to get legal cannabis from that side of things.
One final question.
Thank you. Are there any organized industry efforts to educate or otherwise encourage the FDA to quickly sort of come out with some guidelines? And then the second part is, what would you recommend to for products, let's say CBD water, for example, in the markets where they're going in, pulling them off the shelf, but not really knowing how to handle the situation? What would you recommend to a sort of startup in that regard? Do you wait, or do you sort of just push through and wait until the Department of Health comes in and takes your product away and it's on the third page of the New York Times?
So two questions. First of all, from the CBD, the hemp side of things, there is a hemp roundtable or the hemp authority, and what they're doing, they're about lobbying and putting together good policy, and they're putting together an association that has standards, certification. So someone's mentioned, I think that we could mention that, when they did a test, JAMA did this study that of 83 of the bottles that they tested, only 26 of them had the actual CBD content that was in that bottle. So there's a lot of unregulated issues going on. And so these industries or associations are coming together and say, hey, how do we put certification together? How do we put standards together so we can kind of self-police and help the FDA or regulators take control of this industry from high quality, kind of know your dosing and what you're getting in each case. As far as the beverage side of things, we're seeing a lot of the bigger players hold off, and within the industry, there's a little risk there, but we're seeing those who are willing to take the risk and infuse CBD into a beverage. They're going to the small local natural health stores first and saying, hey, let's try this regionally and sell it there. And I think the FDA is not really focused on that so much, and so you'll have that as kind of the incubation phase, and then it kind of broadens out. From a large retailer standpoint, I think they have a little less risk as far as a manufacturer, and so I think the manufacturers hold off a little bit more because of the risks there. The large retailers will start to maybe move that way in accepting some of this, but still, that's the big unknown is where we go with the FDA in that path. So.
Okay, I think you need to leave CBD off of the label, though, and you also need to cut it with something. You need an inclusion like melatonin, caffeine, something that's more specific in order to stand out these days.